I will be your host tonight and panel facilitator. My name is Luis Martinez. I use he, him pronouns. I am based in LA and I am a campaigns organizer for Fossil Free California. We at Fossil Free California are very excited to facilitate this conversation on the connections and intersectionality of these two campaigns as we really see fossil fuel divestment as a path forward to a just transition away from the fossil fuel industry, fossil fuel phase out, and environmental justice for working class communities. This webinar is going to be going on from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. with Q&A being expected from 7 to 7:30 p.m. Please stay on mute, but feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And please hold your questions till Q&A time so that we can see your questions to flag for our panelists. Once our panel discussion starts to conclude, I will announce that we're starting Q&A. And once that happens, please feel free to start sharing your questions in the chat. This webinar today is also part of our new Environmental Justice Values Program, an educational program meant to educate FFCAers and members of our coalitions about the many aspects of environmental justice organizing with an emphasis on addressing the history of environmental racism, patriarchy, anti-Blackness, ableism, anti-queer bigotry, right? And more systems that have long set barriers against our communities, but also how we can collectively overcome those barriers through just coalition building and strong organizing, like the organizing that we're going to hear about today. So before we begin, I just want to give a huge shout out to our sponsors and endorsers of this webinar tonight. That includes Climate Brunch, Saffron Initiative, CSU Emeritus and Retired Faculty and Staff Association, Santa Cruz, Santa Cruz Climate Action Network, California Nurses for Environmental Health and Justice, 350 Southland Legislative Alliance, Emerson UU Church Environmental Justice Ministry, the Climate Center, Last Chance Alliance, and Extinction Rebellion Los Angeles. Thank you so much for your endorsement of this webinar and for turning out all of your members to see and hear about the amazing work that these incredible four panelists engage in every day. I also want to shout out and thank the organizations that these panelists are representing that are in the room today, which is Scope LA, Stand LA, Climate Branch, De Anza College, and the United Teachers of Richmond. These are big players in the organizing spaces, so it's really amazing to have us all here to talk about the connections of our work. And with that, let's get started. Let's go ahead and turn to our panel. I'm going to ask you all to please introduce yourself by name, your pronouns, the city that you're based in, and your organization. And then please describe what campaign you're representing. So we'll go ahead and start with Raka. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Raka Ray. I'm a biology teacher in Richmond, California. I am a CTA State Council representative for UTR. And today I'll be talking about the CalSTRS divestment campaign to divest from fossil fuels, specifically around SB 252.
Awesome. I'll pass it to Cynthia.
All right. Hey, everybody. So good to see people here. Cynthia Kaufman, she, her pronouns. I live in Pacifica and I teach at community organizing at De Anza College, which is where I'm in my office right now. And I volunteer with Fossil Free California and have for quite a few years.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. I will pass it to Craig.
Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Craig Sheldon. I use any and all pronouns. The organization that I work with is Climate Brunch, and we are based in the greater Los Angeles area, and I live in Pomona, California.
Awesome. Thank you, Craig. And I'll pass it to Tanya.
Everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Tanya Borja, pronouns she, her, ella. I'm based out of South Los Angeles. I work in environmental justice policy at Scope, and the organization that I'm representing is Stand LA. Um, so it's an environmental justice coalition of frontline communities and working groups to end neighborhood oil drilling.
Sounds great. Thank you, Tanya. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our conversation for tonight. I'm going to start with the campaign for fossil fuel divestment. Please describe the evolution of the campaign over this past year. How have you personally built power and momentum in this campaign? Let's start with Raka and then we'll pass it to Cynthia.
Yeah, so the way that I really came into organizing for fossil fuel divestment comes out of the fact that, United Teachers of Richmond was pretty early in calling for fossil fuel divestment for CalSTRS. So when I joined CTA State Council, I was really moved by Youth versus Apocalypse and the organizing that they had been doing coming into these state council meetings and presenting to, the various groups, the various like regional meetings. And so I submitted the NBI last year in order to change the sort of watch position to a support position on the bill. The CTA essentially takes positions on bills typically by referring them into committees. And so all of these, motions or NBIs to take a support position on SB 252 were just going straight to the retirement committee where they were just consistently taking an opposed position on that bill. So that was really my piece around it. And bringing, you know, I would say bringing the Richmond perspective, the direct perspective of the way that Chevron harms our community up here to state council and kind of advocating in that way. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Raka. And yeah, I think part of the connections that we're going to continue to see throughout um, this panel discussion tonight is really the connections between the industry in our communities, like in Richmond, as you were mentioning, Chevron having a big presence in the community through the refinery and the public institutions that are fueling this industry financially and are, um, really coordinating with the fossil fuel industry that has had power for decades in this state to ensure that their profits are growing while CalSTRS members in your case, and workers in general and frontline community members are sort of having to bear the brunt with their pensions being risked due to pension investments in fossil fuels, and also folks who are subjected to negative health impacts. And so, yeah, thank you for mentioning the work that you've done this past year in regards to pushing that divestment bill, SB 252 last year, working to get it through your union specifically. But I'll go ahead and now pass it to Cynthia to share.
All right, yeah. So I've been, as I said before, I've been working on this campaign for about, I think, 6, 7 years. And but the question was about sort of the last year, and a few years ago we decided we were never going to get the boards to voluntarily vote for or choose to divest, and so we were going to need to go for legislation, and so we just keep trying. And so then this year we did have, as Rocco mentioned, SB 252 was a just fantastic bill to require CalPERS and CalSTRS to divest from fossil fuels. And we worked really, really hard on that. We built a great coalition. A lot of my own work was kind of strategy and helping build the steering committee and kind of keeping it function, keeping the sort of structures of the coalition in place. I'm a real strategy person. I love to think about strategy. That and then and then we got defeated in the legislature. So now we're trying to build support in the in and some of our belief is that if we get a couple more strong big unions on board, then in 2026 we can pass that bill. So that's how the campaign was this year. But yeah, I mean, we brought so many good people and there's such kind of deep passion for this work and real enthusiasm for it. So I think we're in a really solid place.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Cynthia. And yeah, union power is everything. Union power is really what's going to move the needle, really ensuring that we incorporate workers into environmental justice advocacy. Awesome. So now for the campaign against neighborhood oil drilling, how does this issue impact communities? What have been some of the victories and challenges over the past year in your community in relation to this campaign? So we're going to start with Craig and then we'll go to Tanya.
Thank you. And um, so this issue impacts communities all across California. Neighborhood oil drilling has significant and profound impacts on individuals' health, individuals' ability to go about their city freely without worry from toxins. And it also just takes up a lot of physical space. So it's going to limit the amount of space that is available for your city to develop something that would be more impactful, positively impactful for the community, like parks or um, making it a more walkable city. And in terms of the victories that we've had over this past year, our main focus has been in Signal Hill opposing an unprecedented 20-year conditional use permit extension by Signal Hill Petroleum. And we were able to do a lot of on-the-ground organizing, getting the local community in Signal Hill involved in opposing this. And there were two uh, city council meetings that were open to the public centered around the conditional use permit. And across those two city council meetings and hundred some odd comments, not a single one was positive. And although we have no direct evidence for this, we suspect that the amount of negative and pushback comments that happened in those two city council meetings had an impact on repealing the referendum for SB 1137, which is the Senate bill for the 1 kilometer setback of all neighborhood drilling. But, we like to tell ourselves that. Um, in terms of challenges, of course, the challenges that we face is a lot of obstacles on the city whenever we're asking for documents, whenever we're asking for what is the plan for um, scaling back neighborhood drilling in Signal Hill. Um, yeah, that's that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Craig. As someone who, speaking for myself, as someone who is from a community that has the highest concentration of drilling in LA, namely in Wilmington, growing up there, I think growing up there really sort of informed me through firsthand experience that um, community input is essential because we are experiencing the health impacts. We're experiencing, even as you're mentioning, how oil and gas wells take up space. Like we hear when that oil and gas well, when that pump jack is malfunctioning, we smell when it's leaking, and we're directly impacted through health issues, right? And so to hear from you that when engaging with Signal Hill, when you turned out all of those community members, not one of them was pro pump checks in their neighborhood, right? It's just so true and so representative of my community as well that um, um, we organized to ensure that we could push these pump jacks away from communities, all communities, and to clean up that land and to ensure that we could redesign that land to be for community and by community, to be rooted in after school centers or community gardens or any need that our neighborhoods need, right? So yeah, thank you for mentioning that awesome organizing that y'all do. And yeah, I'll pass it to you now, Tanya.
Yeah, so how does this issue impact communities? I think the fight is really about like environmental justice and public health. The closer you live to an oil and drilling site, the worse the pollution is. And unfortunately, for many of the our communities, these oil drilling sites, these wells are located in predominantly Latino and Black communities, right? Usually folks that are um, low income, like South LA, like Wilmington. I actually lived in Harbor City for a little bit when I was in middle school, and I remember uh, the big pumpkin that they would turn into a pumpkin in like Halloween time, and all the kids would go and get candy from um, these people that were essentially poisoning our community. Yeah, that the refinery, and a few times in my childhood, I think we would have to evacuate because something had happened at the refinery. So, I mean, living in next to an oil well means constant exposure to toxic chemicals. Um, we had as a campaign, we had a few major wins. Last year, City Council voted to phase out oil drilling citywide. It was a huge victory, something that Stan has been working on for the past decade. But like we know, the oil industry was not having it. And in September of 2024, a judge overturned that. And but luckily, we helped pass AB 3233, which affirmed local governments being able to have the authority to regulate and phase out oil drilling. So it's been an interesting year for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, as someone who is from a frontline community, I really follow a lot of the work that you do in Stand LA and was really following that fight at the city level. And so I guess just a follow-up for you is now that AB 3233 has been successful, what are sort of the next steps that you're personally anticipating for um, the battle against neighborhood oil drilling in LA?
So it now it's really about LA City Council to recommit, reintroduce, and accelerate the phase out ordinance, right? 20 years is an entire generation. There's no way that we can wait that long. So it's really about this year will be about ending it overall in the city of Los Angeles, repassing that oil phase out ordinance, ensuring that sites are shut down at the shortest and most health protective timeline possible, right? Many times people put profit over community, but it's about the health of our community, and then holding polluters accountable for the cleanup. Polluters should pay for the cost of that land, and it should not be left up to community. And then just committed to a just transition. We need workers to have family sustaining jobs and communities to have a say in how the land is repurposed and how fast these wells are shut down.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. All right, so now I'm gonna turn us over to individual questions. And I'll get us started with Cynthia. What has been the mechanism for change? And you talked about this a little bit already as you were mentioning that the public pensions who are some of the top investors in fossil fuels, namely CalPERS and CalSTRS, right? They're sort of uninterested in divestment. So what has been the mechanism for change and ensuring that they divest? Has it been pressuring the boards directly? Has it been engaging, I think partly engaging with unions, right? Or mostly engaging really with unions or has it been something else?
Yeah. So when I first joined the group quite a few years ago, I'll say that it's kind of obvious and easy, right? CalPERS and CalSTRS are two of the biggest pension funds in the world. They have billions in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a dying industry. So, and also investing in those firms, is like investing in our destruction. So, but between the fact that they're bad investments and that it's like just from a money point of view and also bad from like a human survival point of view, it seemed like it wouldn't be that hard. So we did a bunch of like organizing and talking to people and talking to board members and getting people in CTA to talk to their CalSTRS people. And finally we realized they were, and we even did like, well, let's like do a little campaign to kind of really expose some of the board members. We did get a couple of people like State Treasurer Fiona Ma and Superintendent Tony Thurmond to very publicly say that they supported divestment. But those are like, they call it ex officio, they're like government appointee type roles. But just like the other board members, we made zero progress. And one of the things that they said was that they were trying to change the companies, the fossil fuel companies, as stockholders, and that they were engaging with them. And we've seen absolutely no progress over that. I do think that one of the strangest things about doing this work has just been like, why wouldn't they just get out of them? Because really, but anyway, that's another story. So when we finally realized that they were not going to budge, and I will say just very briefly, I think it's like they're part of this sort of little clubby Wall Street world where you don't bring politics in and where you don't stigmatize a business. And we think it's really important to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry. And I will say just a little bit of a tangent for a half a second that part of the goal of fossil fuel divestment is to take away the political power, the social license of the fossil fuel industry. And we've been doing this work for years. And even though, and we've, twice put up bills that didn't make it through. And yet the conversations we've had with legislators and with the public about how terrible that industry is, I think had a real impact on the setbacks bill passing, right? In others, we've already somewhat diminished their political power, which then helps the work that the folks on the ground are doing. So I just think that those things really matter together. So basically what we've been doing then is just trying to build mostly union support because the legislators who have to pass a bill, which we're hoping to pass in 2026, are only going to pass that bill if they think that there's union support from public employee unions, because that's like the constituencies of CalSTRS and CalSTRS and CalPERS. And we've made huge progress in that. People like Rocca are doing that like work on the ground to get that. And so we have a ton of unions. We already did, but we have a couple more we need to get. And once we get those couple more unions and a little more work going, I think we're going to pass the bill in 2026.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, as you were speaking, and as someone who's part of Fossil Free California and works on this campaign right with you, something that I've noticed is how multifaceted this issue is and this campaign is. Like, as you were mentioning, like the power structure is so broad, and I remember we would chart it out in meetings. And yeah, you have the CalPERS and CalSTRS boards themselves who hold so much of that power and yet aren't interested in divestment. And so we have to, like folks who work on drilling, we have to engage with communities and we have to engage with unions and we have to pull in people power because public institutions that are directly funding this destructive, this polluting industry are not going to go out of their way to anger their fossil fuel partners. They're going to stick by them, and so we have to pull in our partners who are stronger, namely unions, communities, youth, people power, right? So yeah, it's great to recognize that connection as well. Awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and pivot to Raka. How pivotal has your union been and is in advancing the mission of CalSTRS divestment of fossil fuels? And what else needs to be done for CalSTRS to listen to labor?
Yeah. So before I kind of answer that question, I did just want to say that, on a personal level, uh, my parents currently live in Torrance, where the Shell refinery is. So when everyone was talking about their personal connections to the oil drilling in Southern California, that really resonates because it's sort of like a out of the frying pan into the fire. I mean, Chevron owns our local newspaper, Richmond Standard, like Standard Oil, um, and does a lot of investment in grants and things like that for education. So, they're pretty influential in the area, and there's also a lot of overlap that I've noticed between um, the targets for divestment from, Israeli genocide as well as fossil fuel divestment. And so when we think about these powers, they're really entrenched in the sense that like the US is a planned war economy, right? And when we talk about climate change, like a lot of those weapons manufacturings, a lot of those things, they have a lot of crossover with these oil companies. So the reason I say that is yes, fossil fuels are a dying beast, but a beast is also very dangerous when it's hurt and it thinks that it's, being threatened, right? So, you know, United Teachers of Richmond, we have been, on the earlier side of these campaigns and endorsing them officially. I think that, you know, one of the benefits is that UTR is also a part of the California Alliance for Community Schools. So it's allied with the other large urban locals in California. And we're currently, our bargaining dates are expiring in June. And so we're kind of in coordinating our bargaining. So there's a lot of potential for like cross union collaboration through this alliance. Um, and many of these locals are like more progressive locals who have done divestment resolutions of their own. So I would say that CACs, UTR, these are orgs on kind of the forefront or unions that are kind of on the forefront of this. However, it's not necessarily about listening to labor per se, right? Because the people who are making the decisions to not divest, the people who are, on the board, the issue is really that they're very sort of cozy with this like fossil fuel oligarchy system that we have going on. And it really is going to take, I think, more of like a mass movement within labor to get these board members to either willingly divest or to get our state council to support divestment because CTA officially has never supported any form of divestment for CalSTRS. So that's kind of it's a pretty protracted fight, I would say, because it's not just about listening, right? It's like there's people who are personally benefiting through for their career or whatever by not by, cozying up to power and not necessarily listening to what's right or what makes the most sense on the ground. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for describing that. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, as this conversation is about connections between different issues, intersections between different political campaigns. Yeah, thank you for mentioning the connection between fossil fuel divestment and divestment of genocide being conducted by the Israeli government in Gaza, right? As you were mentioning, um, I was remembering that during a protest last year, I feel like the word divestment was sort of becoming in even outside of organizing, it was becoming in like the collective vocabulary. And I think the connections between different issues were becoming a little bit easier for even like uh non-organizer or like non-activist folks that I personally know to see between certain issues that divestment is really about taking away funding and power from an industry, in our case, the fossil fuel industry, and in the other case, um, sending weapons to Israel, taking money and power away from an industry that is unsustainable, but also unjust. And fossil fuels really being a fuel for war as well, being used in warfare and in genocide, being another huge connection as well, um, I think is good to mention. So thank you for doing that. Um, Great. As we're talking about connections, I'm gonna go ahead now and turn the spotlight over to Craig. Um, So, Craig, are you from Signal Hill, and has this played a role into the community outreach efforts that Climate Brunch leads? And how has your background in chemistry shaped your work against neighborhood oil drilling?
So I'm not from Signal Hill. I live in Pomona, which is about 30-ish miles to the east of it. And how that has affected my organizing has is in short, not very much, only the commute to and from Signal Hill for any events that we might be hosting. Because it's really more about getting the folks who are there more involved. So I'll go and I'll do canvassing to get to educate the local population. This is what's happening to your city. Uh, Here's what you can do about that. Um, which leads directly into the second part of your question. How has being a chemist affected my organizing in every way possible? I got my PhD in atmospheric chemistry. So I have a very deep and intimate understanding of how emissions work. How do emissions evolve? How do they affect health? How do they travel from one place to another? Which is another reason why I ultimately say, like, being in Pomona doesn't affect my organizing because I want the drilling in Signal Hill to stop because emissions travel and they will, no matter where you are in the world, the type of emissions that we are talking about will impact you. Um, and also, with my background as an academic, I have the capacity to dig through academic literature and present it to the public in using more layman's terms because academic papers like to use all of the $6 words that can make it very cumbersome to understand. And on top of that, just having access to those papers. Um, so that is one of the biggest impacts I have had with the organizing for climate brunches, having access to academic papers, being able to read them and present them effectively.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, again, like as myself, somebody who's from a frontline community, being able to have the data and the science to show legislators and like fossil fuel industry lobbyists who try to like say otherwise, that no, your emissions don't just cause climate change, but they also are directly um impeding me from thriving. They're causing asthma, cancer, nosebleeds, headaches, birth defects even, right? And so to have this data and this science readily at hand as a tool to be used for our organizing efforts, for our advocacy is so crucial and so pivotal in the struggle for environmental justice in our communities and the struggle against neighborhood oil drilling. So yeah, thank you for being a part of our campaigns.
And that's also like you kind of hit the nail on the head of like one of the things that makes our advocacy easier is the fact that the science does agree with what we are saying. The science does support the claims that we are making. It's whenever people are trying to advocate for oil that they have to really mangle the data. We can just look at it and say, here it is. Read what it says. It is in support of what it is we are trying to do.
Exactly, amazing. All right, I'm gonna turn over to Tanya. Um, so given the recent fires in Los Angeles, in a city that has a high concentration of oil drilling, how have the fires drawn the connections between climate change and fossil fuel pollution closer together in the communities that you work in?
Sure. So it the thing is, it wasn't just a wildfire, right? It was a climate catastrophe. It was a direct result of climate change, right? Um, After decades of burning coal, oil, and gas, and also, to be honest, just the colonial fire management policies that we have here in Southern California, the lack of indigenous fire stewardship, all of that is just a deadly consequence of everything that's been happening for a long time. Like LA has the highest concentration of urban oil fields in the country. So the same companies that are fueling fossil fuels are also destroying our environment, causing these fires to burn quicker, faster, stronger than we've ever seen, right? So, and nobody knows that more than frontline communities. Nobody knows that more than BIPOC communities that are already living with high levels of air pollution because of oil drilling, because of freeways, because of industrial sites. Um, so yeah, I mean the same industries that are polluting our neighborhoods are fueling the climate crisis. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that. I was following some of the aftermath of the fires and still am monitoring the aftermath of the fires, what folks are having to go through, especially folks who have lost their homes. Um, has Stand LA or Scope LA, who you also work with, at all been involved in some of the mutual aid or some of the rebuilding that has been prominent after the fires since?
So, Scope LA is part of the Los Angeles Fire Rapid Response Team. We were actually a drop-off site in South LA where folks could drop off donation masks, gift cards, because although the fires didn't happen in South LA or Wilmington, a lot of our folks work in the Palisades, work in Pasadena, work in Altadena. So these communities were still affected. So we have done some mutual aid like cash assistance, diapers, all that stuff. I actually live in Pasadena currently, and it feels like folks are forgetting a little bit, but our communities still need a lot of help and a lot of support.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Just a quick note on that for me personally, like it was so infuriating for me seeing like some of the local news coverage, like over at hyper focusing like 20 instances of looting, which is serious, but underplaying the how really the LA community, literally in the entire community was organizing in a way that I haven't seen like ever in my life. Like I haven't seen LA like do that much like grassroots organizing ever. And literally like everybody was out in the street. Everybody was donating water and food and resources to sites like yours in Scope LA and other grassroots communities really tackling folks' issues head on, right? And so it was really amazing to see a community rally together and to really engage in that collective care, that collective organizing together. And I think it just shows like the radical potential in LA, right, to organize for better living conditions, better workplace conditions in general. I'm very excited for the future of organizing in LA. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for addressing those individual questions. I'm going to go ahead and now ask us some group questions. So, if you feel like taking these on, please go ahead and jump in. So, our first group question is, with the information from this webinar, how does learning about the opposite campaign inform yours about the connections and the intersections of these issues.
I guess I can jump in on that. For me personally, at least, it shows that there is a degree of cross-organizing that we can use to bolster the other campaign. Like before I was introduced to this webinar, I was unaware of the divestment from the pension funds that were mentioned. And so knowing that there are more allies that we can reach out to and get different perspectives in order to effectively achieve our individual campaign while also supporting the other campaign.
Amazing. Thank you, Craig. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I guess I'll just say that the ultimate goal is to save the climate and save our communities, right? And our ultimate enemy really is the fossil fuel industry. And so it's like we're coming at it from some different angles, and it's really nice to be like not just like, oh yeah, like we're doing this and there's these other people over there doing that, but to actually be really working more kind of like intentionally in community with each other and building relationships with each other. I think it's really powerful. And I think about this, the bill that's coming up this year, which is the polluter pays bill, which is hopefully going to go through the California legislature, that basically like makes the fossil fuel industry pay for things like the disasters in Los Angeles. I think it's a really nice thing that's sort of in the middle of all of that, because what we want to do is we want to stop the drilling in people's communities. We want to stop the burning of fossil fuels, and we have all these different mechanisms to do it, right? So both from stopping the permits at Signal Hill, closing, passing the bill for the setbacks, and also delegitimizing the industry so they don't have the political power to stop those things. So I really do see it as all part of the exact same struggle, but that they're different parts of it. And when you're working together for the same goal, but you're different people, the more you have good actual relationships with people and you understand each other's language and each other's approach, kind of like, and also then you can act in solidarity, just the stronger we are as a movement. So for me, it's super exciting.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. Would anyone else like to take that on?
Yeah, I think just really quickly, I would say that, hearing about the neighborhood drilling campaigns, I think it really ties into what I was saying earlier about the divestment movement needing to be like a mass movement. And so I think there's a lot of those tactics that can be applied to just rank and file organizing at the different locals that, maybe they've done a divestment resolution, but they could take like a next step and have more people show up to like Fossil Free California events, like the one, in Richmond, I think on March 10th, right? Um,
11th, March 11th.
March 11th. Thanks for the reminder. Um, so yeah, I think that there's a lot of ways to implement some of the strategies that are being used in the neighborhood oil drilling within our divestment campaign.
Yeah, and just to say that I think more than ever, as communities, as organizers, as just people in the movement, we need to work together. Politicians, policymakers, they need to hear us. They need to hear the people that are living in these communities, the people that are working on these sites. It's time.
Exactly. Thank you everyone for sharing. I have about two more group questions for us, and then I see we're almost at the 7 p.m. mark, which is around where we want to start Q&A. So for all of our guests here tonight, if you have any questions for our panelists, please start to put them in the chat. And once our Q&A starts, we'll have all of these questions queued up and lined up for our panelists here. Feel free to either direct your question to somebody in particular or just the group in general. So go ahead and please start thinking of questions and start submitting them in the chat once you're ready. Thank you. Okay, So our next group question, given the White House chaos, right, with this new administration and the rise of fascism that supports destructive industries like the fossil fuel industry, how do you anticipate the White House chaos could impact the fight for environmental justice in California?
So honestly, the oil industry is really emboldened right now, and we're already seeing it right with Trump's drill baby drill. It's back in full force, and fossil fuel companies really feel protected, and they're doubling down on extraction and fighting regulations at every level. Um, Even with what happened before Trump got elected, right? With the oil phase out in LA, we fought over a decade to get neighborhood oil drilling banned. And the moment we won, oil companies sued the city and a judge overturned their victory. And that kind of corporate aggression isn't happening in a vacuum, right? The industry knows that it has federal allies that are willing to roll back on regulations and prioritize profits over people. And then, I mean, California has some of the best and strongest environmental protections in the country, but federal policies still impact us greatly. We wanted to use some federal funds for the Inglewood oil field remediation, and Trump is directly attacking EJ as a whole and attacking California as a whole, right? Because we are the um, movement shakers. What happens in California has a ripple effect in what happens in the rest of the country. So that being said, California is still home to some of the biggest and largest fossil fuel corporations in the world. So, I mean, this next 4 years will be tough, but it's more than ever, like with the previous question, more than ever, as people in the movement, as organizations, as coalitions, we got to work together to support our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you. Would anyone else like to answer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess I want to just reiterate some of the things that Tanya just said. And just like remember the Koch brothers, right? That the reason we have this kind of fascist stuff going on in this country is precisely because of the fossil fuel industry, right? It's not just sort of random right-wing garbage. It's actually fossil fuel funded, and it's so much of so much of the kind of the impetus for this sort of extreme politics we're having is because there's a whole movement. The whole world is sort of moving in a transition away from a world based on like destruction, profit, and greed and hatred to a world based on things that are solidarity, sustainability, things that work for all of us. And they saw us coming, and this is like a frontal move to push us back. So it's also sort of important to remember that the sort of liberal facade of like, oh yeah, neoliberal capitalism, everything is fine and we'll just keep drilling, like that wasn't working, right? It was starting to fall apart. And so then this is like a reactionary move against that. So just want to remind you people of that. And then also like the idea that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and so there's a way that right now, like people all over the world really are just being slammed by this horrible stuff, and terrible things are happening and are gonna happen. But also we can make really great things happen in California at the same time, and at the same time and California is both a very fighting and progressive state, and it's also a petro state, so, and it's also a state that has more homeless people than any other state in the country. So we've got some work to do here in California. So the idea that we could actually build a state that works and that isn't a petro state, like we can work on that now, even under Trump. And yes, lots of our federal grants are under attack, and there's all kinds of crazy, terrible things happening. But we can actually make all of these things happen even under this administration. And I think for so many people, like the bigger picture on the federal and global level is so terrible that it's a great opportunity to be in a place where we can actually move the ball forward in terms of building a world of justice that works for everybody. So, and I think that's one of the reasons there's actually quite a bit of excitement about the work that we're doing right now.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that as well. Like, okay, I guess my question is this a safe space? Because Um, I think when we talk about fascism, it's really important that we define fascism because it's something that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? So I personally tend to believe, I think it was like Mussolini's definition, that it's really a a total conglomeration of the government with corporation, right? And in that endeavor, we can view sort of the aesthetic parts of fascism to be like marketing, you know? So they use this like ultra nationalist, like ultra racist like form of marketing to push forward this heavy privatization like front, right? Where we're going to live as medieval serfs again, under this like techno-feudal rule, right? Um, so in that sense, fascism has been here. It's been here since like Citizens United, and I think that if we're clear on that, it's a lot easier to not despair about what's happening because this is the logical conclusion of neoliberal capitalism. Like liberals will always side with fascists over real progressives, right? And that's what we're seeing. So I think given how sort of effete the resistance, right, has been to Trump and his fascist policies so far, that really, sorry, the light in my house is like dying. That really gives an opportunity for us as activists and organizers to show that there's another way of doing things. That the fact that the Democratic Party is so strong in California and that there's so much homelessness, there's such little investment in education, that the cost of living is so high, that is a direct relationship. That's not a coincidence, right? And so, you know, and again, these are all just like my personal views, right? Not the views of United Teachers of Richmond. But I think that the sooner we get real about the fact that there's no one coming to save us, the sooner we can start to build kind of like another option, similar like to what we've seen in Mexico in the past like 20 years.
Yes, I agree 1000%, Raka. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and to build on that a little, I'll just be brief. Like for the work that we do in Climate Brunch, like I really don't think that it's going to change how we approach things and how we do things because we started this campaign when there was a Democrat in office, and like now we're just continuing the campaign with a Republican in office, although it is a much scarier fascist Republican, but it like what we're doing is still needs to be done, regardless of who's in office.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for this incredible conversation so far. We're gonna shortly turn it over to Q&A, but before I do that, I'm just gonna plug some links that y'all gave me, and then if you have anything else to plug or talk about regarding your campaign or your organization, I'll toss it back to you. But if not, then we'll get started with Q&A. So I have a couple of links for the chat here that I'm just gonna ping down. Gonna first start with Cynthia. She wrote an amazing article on taking political power away from the fossil fuel industry that I want to share with y'all. It is down below in the chat. Please read it. That would be incredible. Please visit Stand LA's website that Tanya provided to me. Um, here's two links that Raka provided that discusses or that actually shows some examples of divestment resolutions that you can pass in your union. And then below that is a YouTube link to a video that was just recently recorded at the latest CTA State Council of CTA local presidents, locals who support CalSTR's divestment of fossil fuels, saying that our union supports, we're proud that our union supports, here's why we support fossil fuel divestment, and here's why your local should support fossil fuel divestment as well. And last but not least, please check out the Instagram page of Climate Brunch. Is there anything else that y'all would like to share with the audience?
Yeah, just follow us, Stand LA on socials, follow our website. We're going to be posting calls to action and upcoming events that folks can join. We also have a space where you can share your story. If you or your family have been impacted by oil drilling, we have a space where you can make your voice heard. We also have a mailing list where we keep you updated on just how the campaign is going.
That sounds great. Thank you, Tanya. Anyone else have anything more to share? All right. If not, with that, I will now be passing it to our Q&A questions. So here's the first one. I want to ask that someone give a defense of how divesting from fossil fuels does not mean risking our pensions. This is the biggest argument I hear from my peers, and I don't have the financial info to refute it. People tell me I agree with the idea, but I really depend on my pension. I wish our website would post an info sheet of how divestment could be a safer path. So we do have links regarding that, that I think I saw some folks in the chat providing that already, but I'll double check again. But yeah, would anyone like to address this question?
Yeah, because I've been addressing that question for like 10 years, right? So it's like, because you're right. Whoever said that, I think they might have left, but like that is a super persistent question. There's a whole bunch of different answers. So one of them is that the fossil fuels are a dying industry. Right now, they kind of took a little bit of an upturn because of the whole Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is a great time to sell those funds. They're not a huge part of people's pensions either. So basically, we have tons and tons of resources and sort of people in the world of finance who've made really powerful cases. Diana also just there's a really nice little video that explains this, but there's also like links to studies and reports that show that it's a really one of the least productive sectors of the S&P 500 of the stock market. So yeah, so that's just that's an easy argument to refute, but you got to get into the weeds to do it.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Cynthia. Would you like to also step in, Raka, for this question?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a complex question to answer because, the evidence, there's a lot of evidence that fossil fuel companies have invested in like research and papers to show that, oh, actually, divestment is a bad thing, right? And so sometimes it can be difficult to show like evidence in terms of academic paperwork to prove like 100% this is good for your pension, right? You're not going to lose money. But I think I would just kind of break it down a little bit more simpler. Like what's happening with the price of gas? What's going on with, the fires, right? Um, People can directly experience the way in which climate change is impacting their lives and affecting our economy, right? So, I think my tactic for that is just to kind of take it to a rational perspective. Like, this is a finite resource. we can't keep drilling, right? We can't keep doing this because we're seeing the effects immediately. So, oh, and then I just saw Nancy's comment in the chat. Yes, that is another piece of evidence that is brought to State Council as well, that there are similar pension funds that are actually doing the same, if not better, having divested. Um, so yeah, so those would be my sort of responses to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Raka. Great. Gonna go ahead and move on to our next um, question. It says, I know that the climate bond was what we passed last November has funding dedicated for environmental justice work, and the polluters pay bill has language about 40% going to frontline communities. How should some of the funds be spent? Would anyone like to take that question?
It was a big question, big ask.
Yeah, can you repeat
Um,
it? Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, I know that the climate bond we passed last November has funding dedicated for environmental justice work, and the polluters pay bill has language about 40% going to frontline communities. How should some of the funds be spent?
I'm not too familiar with what was passed, but I think that if there are federal or state funds, they should be directed towards projects that remedy existing harm and build long-term resilience in these frontline communities, like environmental remediation, renewable energy efficiency, green job training, um, public health and community service, and like community-led planning and capacity building. I think more, even in the activist and organizer space, we need to at all times have community be there and say, hey, I'm an expert in the city that I live in. I'm an expert in my hometown. A community should always be at the front line of what is being done with this money and how.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit towards the end there, Tanya, but we pretty much got the gist of what you were saying in regards to communities really being at the forefront as well, really having a voice in where these funds are allocated to, since disproportionately low-income communities of color have been really disproportionately bearing the brunt of fossil fuel pollution and the health harms that come with fossil fuel pollution, but also climate change itself. As in my community, it's not just like the poor air quality condition from the refineries and the drill and the pump jacks. It is that, but it's also climate change. It's also extreme heat events. It's also power outages, right? It's flooding. And so um I think that, as you were mentioning, we need to fund a robust program that addresses the climate and pollution harm that has been done across the country, across the world, really, if we need to do that, that addresses that harm and that works to mitigate it via, yeah, resilience centers, as you were mentioning, essentially preparing communities for climate change impacts that are going to continue to arise every year. Great. Would anyone like to address that question as well?
Yeah, I also am not entirely familiar with these funds, but if you're asking for my personal opinion, directly addressing the problems that we know that oil drilling and an oil investment has done to the communities. Like one of the biggest question marks with closing wells is how should they be capped and how they should be monitored. And that's definitely something that regardless of when or how we divest and how we shut down oil drilling here in California, that is another problem that needs to be addressed. So developing technologies to ensure that there are no methane leakages from capped oil wells, making sure there is monitoring for where these oil wells were, and ensuring that they're not going to continue to be a danger.
So we did actually have a polluters pay campaign in Richmond. So I believe that there was a settlement. Luis, I don't know how, if you know, like how much it was between the city of Richmond and Chevron. But that is part of the conversation we're having at the moment is how to distribute those funds. I'm biased, obviously, as a teacher. I'm like, put it into education, invest it in the students. But I really feel like I really feel like the sort of economic depression that's hit the Bay is pretty, intense in terms of people leaving, people getting pushed out, priced out, lack of jobs, tech layoffs, all of that stuff. And so, we've hit like a little bit more of a depression period. So I feel like investing that money into the local economy in ways that will um, just directly empower the people who live here. Um, yeah, I think that that's probably the most I have in terms of suggestions or ideas, but we'll have to see right now because I think that it's also going to take more advocacy to make sure that the community is involved in the decision making around what happens with those funds. So,
Yes, thank you, Raka. And as Woody Hastings in the chat and Diana were mentioning, it's a 550 million settlement, $550 million settlement. Yeah, just wanted to mention that. Over 10 years. Thank you, Diana. Um, Great. So I see your comment, Sally. I think you asked this question and I saw your hand up earlier. Did you wanna did you wanna come off mute to quickly address the question?
Sure. I worked for the City of LA Housing Department for almost 30 years, actually from like 1993 until I retired a couple years ago. And I never paid that much attention to legislation because, there are thousands of bills introduced. But what I really focused on was creating programs. So we created a program that inspected housing for people. I applied for lead-based paint grants all the time. We were involved with conversations about how those programs should be structured. And so, um, and and we have really strong tenant activists in the city of LA, and they would come to city council and they would say, you need to do this. Same thing with the oil. I mean, for years, the Catholic Church running those oil drills right near, downtown in USC, all of that. And that is just so important. It's so important to be at the table and to be part of the conversation about how those, and particularly at the state level, how those grant programs, is the money actually going to flow? Because I mean, look, we're all in bureaucracies, but the state is really slow on some of these things. They didn't even want to implement some of the laws that we passed a year ago for notice and for corporations to talk about the risk to their activities from climate change and what their impacts are and stuff, because they said there wasn't enough state money to implement it. So it's a really important area of action that I don't want to get kind of pushed to the side. Like we can say, yeah, people should be involved. Well, who is getting involved? And there's got to be some folks who are dedicated to making those kind of connections, not just working on new bills. So just my 40 years of working in the affordable housing field in California, and which is really messed up, as you all know. So it's hard, and the oil industry is a much harder opponent than the apartment associations. So I'm part of this struggle now, but I just wanted to say it's really rewarding too, and getting people to come and speak in Spanish at public meetings where they never spoke before and said, yeah, we need this. We need a park in Hollywood or whatever the issue is, right? I watched that when I was just waiting for my items to come up. So I just think the work that you all do is really important and I really appreciate it. I just want to say that too. It's really hard. But focus on the money. You know, we voted for money. Let's make sure we get it. So,
Thank you for your
thank you,
comments,
Luis.
Helen. Thank you. All right. We have another question. This one's directed towards Cynthia. How can the successful examples of international divestment from fossil fuels be used to sway California stakeholders to divest from CalPERG/CalSTRS? I think they mean CalPERS. I specifically think of the Dutch pension fund ABP, which is the ninth largest public pension fund in the world, larger than both CalPERS and CalSTRS. They divested several years ago, and pensions for members are fine.
Yeah, no, so that's one of there's a web page I think it's called Fossil Free, just plain Fossil Free, not Fossil Free California, that kind of keeps track of all of these divestments. And yet, and I don't know what the recent number is, but it's, the last time I looked, it was 11 trillion, but I think it might be up to like 14 or something like that trillion dollars worth of investments globally have divested from fossil fuels. So yeah, it's huge. And the example, and so we use those examples all the time. And I would say that some of the most powerful examples are University of California, right? Students organized for 10 years to get, well, and faculty and staff too, but it was a lot of students out front organized to get the University of California to divest. And they finally divested, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And their chief investment officer says it was purely for financial reasons, of course, but the pressure really helped. California State University has divested. So there's also more local examples, but and then the state of New York. So yeah, there's all kinds of great examples of institutions that have divested. And as I mentioned earlier too, that there were both Makita and BlackRock, that are two like big, mainstream financial like institutions, did studies on those who have divested and the impacts on the pension funds, and it's really clear that it has an absolutely minimal impact on returns. So yeah, those using those examples is super important.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. All right. I'll ask two more questions for us. One of them is a potential ally I don't see utilized often is the YIMBY movement, or Yes in My Backyard movement. Oil companies own a significant amount of urban land, which could be developed into housing for all income levels, affordable housing, as well as market rate. The YIMBY movement has expertise in areas related to land use, zoning, and surface rights, which oil companies use to limit converting land to other used. Um, I think your question might have been cut off, or I'm missing your question, so please complete it in the chat. But based off that, did anyone want to address the comment?
So, one thing that we have done with our organizing in Signal Hill, uh, is to talk to like local HOAs and um, larger community structures like that, like apartment complexes and stuff like that, to talk to people about zoning in their city and how to properly utilize their land. Um, because one of the things that happens in Signal Hill specifically is Signal Hill Petroleum is the only name in town, and they are also the biggest real estate developing company in Signal Hill. And so they have like this weird dual function in Signal Hill that they are trying to do. And so I've really been trying to push talking about what does zoning mean in your city? How does uh their not only drilling in your neighborhood affect you, but also how they are choosing to develop the land around you. Like, what are their responsibilities for capping wells and making sure their capped wells are safe? How does that affect the development within your city? Do you want your city to continue to grow? These are the kinds of questions that we bring to these organizations to pull them more to our side.
Makes sense. Thank you for answering, Craig. Would anyone else like to jump in? All right. I'll go ahead and ask us one more question. Um, how do you combat all of the misinformation that is being put out there by politicians and the fossil fuel industry from environmental impact to pension divestment? Thank you. So, question about addressing misinformation.
This isn't a very good answer, but I just feel like that's the problem of our time, right? When you just think about what's going on politically in this country, is that the levels of mis and disinformation are so high. I think, I mean, all you can really do is have a great comms thing on your own side. Like, yeah, that's Manjari's doing amazing work for Fossil Free. That you've just got to put out clear messages and and think about how misinformation is circulating and to whom it's circulating. And if it's circulating to people that matter, then you've got to deal with it. And if it's just some I mean, and I'll just tell you, like, when both, I mean, we've had so much crazy misinformation coming out of CalPERS and CalSTRS, right? Where they literally lie about all kinds of things. And these are like public entities. And there's a part of me that thinks like we should go after them just for like, that's like a breach of public trust for a public entity to just like flat out lie. Then what we've done is we've just, done, the nerdy thing, right? Like you do the research and you figure it out and what's the truth and you put out your truth against their lie. But ultimately, I think generally when you're doing organizing, you've more got to just affirmatively put out your own messages, right? And not be thrown by the crap that's just being thrown out. That's, yeah.
Yeah, and to build on that as well, like one of the biggest advantages of having a PhD is people hear Dr. Craig Sheldon, they're like, oh, that guy, gotta listen to that guy. So definitely like using the credentials that we have is a very powerful motivator and a very powerful like indicator that I know what I'm talking about. Like here's the information that you have. And also, what is, in my opinion, the most important thing for addressing mis or disinformation to people is speaking to whomever you're talking to at the level that they are at. Because for example, like I could go in and talk about all of the amazing chemistry that happens in the atmosphere, but as soon as I draw a reaction, I'm going to lose 80% of the people that I'm talking to. So knowing your audience and knowing how to give them the information in such a way that they will receive it, that is the most important thing by far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to mention that as we were talking about earlier, Craig, about uh, on the ground advocacy, frontline communities advocating for um, setbacks between their neighborhoods and oil drilling, and also advocating for divestment, right? Like speaking as somebody from Wilmington, it's a low income community. It's mostly a community of color. I remember myself expressing this and hearing other folks express like, how could I advocate for environmental justice? Like, I don't know any of like the technicalities. I don't know of like any of the science. Like, w- how do I contribute? Like, what do I know? And essentially, like, I remember organizers that actually started with Communities for a Better Environment, and their organizers being like, no, like, you're a community expert. Like, you do know what's going on in your neighborhood. You literally know where each of the five refineries in your community is located. You know how their emissions impact you and your neighbors. You know where those pump jacks are in your neighborhoods, which residents they're impacting, whose backyard that pump jack sits next to, what park those pump jacks live in, what parking lot at your local church that that pump jack lives in and drills in and emits these harmful toxins into your air. You're aware of all of these issues, and because of this and because of your lived experience, you are an expert of how fossil fuel pollution impacts your community, and the science agrees with you and the science backs you up. Um, would anyone else like to address this question?
Say that as far as ending neighborhood oil drilling, like there's a reason that these oil companies choose to sue, because they're afraid of the ballot. They're afraid that that we're gonna go out there and we're gonna vote for what we literally see in our community. So I feel like as far as misinformation in the Bay and in the South Bay, it's not an issue about not understanding. It's more of a feeling of legislators, well, I'm gonna be up in arms about this and no one's gonna do anything about it. So it's really just giving folks that that voice to hold people accountable, hold these polluters accountable to making a change.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Would anyone else like to go for the question?
Um, I think, the good stuff's been said already, but definitely want to echo like a good comms team is so, so important. Um, you kind of have to like battle propaganda with propaganda, like pro climate propaganda in a way that um not like misinformation, but just make it like snappy, memorable, um, like in the way that divestment is now like this word that people understand what we're talking about, and just keep doing that.